Ada Brooks had turned down 7 men in 3 years, and the whole town of Millhaven, Texas, had long since stopped trying to understand why. It was the spring of 1878, and the flat, sun-hammered land outside Millhaven was just beginning to show its brief, stubborn beauty. Bluebonnets pushed up along the creek beds. Mockingbirds rattled through their morning songs before the heat silenced them. The sky in those early weeks of April stretched so wide and so blue that a person could stand on the porch of the Brooks homestead and feel, for just a moment, as though they were the only soul left in the entire world. Ada often stood on that porch precisely for that reason. She was 24 years old. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned away from her face during working hours and let fall loose only when she was certain no one could see. She had her father's square jaw and her mother's eyes, which were a particular shade of gray-green that made people think of distant storms. She ran the homestead alone, now 120 acres of dry Texas land, a small herd of cattle, a vegetable garden, a milk cow named Hester, and a barn that needed its east wall repaired before summer arrived in earnest. She had been running it alone for 2 years, ever since her father, Calvin Brooks, had died of a fever that came on sudden in June and was done with him by July. Her mother, Marguerite, had passed 4 years before that, carried off by the same kind of exhausted grief that claims people who have worked too hard for too long. Ada had no siblings. She had a small savings kept in a tin box under the floorboard of the kitchen. She had a Winchester rifle she could shoot with reasonable accuracy. She had a stubbornness that the women of Millhaven admired quietly, and the men of Millhaven found inconvenient. The suitors had started coming 6 months after her father's death, which was, Ada thought, a decently respectful interval. She had not been surprised by them. A woman alone on a working ranch was a practical proposition. That was how most of the men who came to her door seemed to think about it, a practical proposition. She could cook, and she could work, and she had land, and she was not unpleasant to look at. These things together added up to something useful. Ned Farrow had come first, the son of the grain merchant on the east side of town. He had arrived wearing his Sunday coat on a Tuesday and had told her, with great confidence, that he could manage the ranch for her, and that she would not need to concern herself with the cattle any more. Ada had thanked him politely and closed the door. Hank Tillerman had come next, a cattle rancher from the county over who had more land than sense, and who had spent most of his visit talking about his own spread, and asking whether she had considered that a woman running land by herself was asking for trouble. Ada had offered him water for his horse and shown him the gate. After that there had been Tom Schultz, who was kind enough but who smelled strongly of tobacco and kept glancing at the furniture as though he was calculating its value. Then there was young Denny Pratt, who was barely 20 and had been put up to it by his mother. Then there was George Alderman, the widower from the Methodist Church, who was 51 years old and had told Ada she reminded him of his first wife in a way that he clearly thought was a compliment. Then Reverend Hutchins's nephew, who had ridden in from San Antonio and seemed to think that Ada's primary need was spiritual guidance. And most recently, just last month, there had been Carl Whiting, who had money and manners and who had made a perfectly reasonable case for marriage in a voice so flat and businesslike that Ada had felt, by the end of it, like a parcel of land being surveyed. She had said no to every one of them. And the town of Millhaven had exhaled a collective breath of exasperation and bewilderment, and the women of the ladies' circle had debated whether Ada Brooks was simply too proud or simply too heartbroken or simply too stubborn to see what was good for her, and none of them had landed on the right answer, which was this. Ada Brooks had never once had any of those men look at her like she was a person rather than a solution. That was the spring. And into that spring, like so many things in the West, Isaac Barker had ridden quietly and without announcement. He had come to work for Jonas Purdy, who ran the largest cattle operation in the county and who was always in need of skilled hands for the spring drive. Isaac had hired on as a working cowboy breaking horses, mending fence lines, moving cattle. He was 28 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men who work outdoors become weathered, with brown hair that curled slightly at the collar and dark eyes that were attentive without being intrusive. He was not a man who talked much. The other hands at Purdy's spread had noted this about him within the first day and had mostly respected it. He did his work well, and he did not complain, and he did not start trouble, and in the economy of bunkhouse life, those qualities made a man worth keeping around regardless of whether he was talkative. Isaac had come originally from Missouri. He had worked cattle drives for 6 years, moving with the seasons up through Kansas, back through Texas, out toward the New Mexico territory. He did not talk about his past at any length, which was not unusual in that time and place. Men came west for many reasons, and the courtesy of the frontier was that you did not ask them to account for all of theirs. What was unusual about Isaac Barker was a thing so small that most people would have missed it, and in fact, most people did miss it. He noticed things, not in the calculating way of a man sizing up an opportunity, but in the way of a person who finds the world genuinely interesting. He noticed when the color of the grass changed at the creek's edge. He noticed the way a horse held its ears when it was uncertain. He noticed, on his third day working fence along the property line that bordered Ada Brooks's homestead, that there was a woman on the other side of the wire who was working alone in the early morning heat, digging a post hole with a bar that was clearly too heavy for one person to manage comfortably, and doing it anyway without complaint. He did not call out to her. He watched for a moment, respectfully and from a distance, then went back to his own fence line. He was not the sort of man to announce himself. Ada had noticed him too, though she would not have admitted it immediately. She had seen the Purdy hands riding the fence line and had given them no particular thought. It was routine work, and Purdy's men were always in and out along that border. But there was one of them who did not whistle or call to each other the way the others did. He worked quietly. She had noticed that about him on the first day. In the peripheral way, a person notices something without meaning to, the way you notice when a sound that has always been present suddenly goes absent. She had gone on with her work. She had her own fence to think about. It was the middle of April, a Wednesday, when the first wildflowers came. Ada had ridden into Millhaven in the morning to pick up a sack of flour and a new chain for the barn door, and to drop off 3 dozen eggs with Mrs. Ponder at the general store, who sold them on commission. She had gone, done her business, exchanged a few words with the women she knew, declined an invitation to join the ladies' circle for their Thursday meeting, because Thursday she had to repair the east wall of the barn, and ridden home again. When she came around the side of the house to put her horse, a bay mare named Copper, in the paddock, she saw them. A bundle of wildflowers, tied loosely with a strip of plain twine, set on the top of the porch railing. Bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush and a few stems of yellow prairie coneflower. Nothing elaborate, not arranged in any careful way, just gathered from the land the way you gathered them when you were walking and happened to see them and thought someone might like to have them. Ada stood in the paddock gate for a long moment and looked at the flowers. She looked around the property, but there was no one visible in any direction. She unsaddled Copper and put her in the paddock and walked up to the porch and picked up the bundle. There was no note, no card, no indication of who had left them or why. She stood on the porch with the flowers in her hands and felt something she could not quite name, something that was not quite suspicion and not quite pleasure, but was something in between, a cautious noticing of a thing she had not expected. She put them in a canning jar of water and set them on the kitchen table, and did not think about them consciously for the rest of the afternoon, which meant she thought about them constantly. The next morning she repaired the east wall of the barn. It was hard work, replacing the boards that had warped and cracked over the winter, hauling new lumber from the stack behind the barn, measuring and nailing. She worked steadily and well, the way she did everything. By noon she was sweating through her shirt and her arms were aching, and she was satisfied with the progress in the way that doing good physical work makes a person satisfied. She went to the creek to wash her hands and face and drink water. The creek ran along the northeast edge of her property, shallow in the dry months but lively enough now in spring. She crouched at the bank and splashed water on her face and looked up and saw, across the fence on the Purdy side of the line, a cowboy working with a length of wire and a pair of pliers, repairing a section of fence where a post had leaned. He did not look up when she came to the creek. He was focused on his work. But after a few moments, when Ada did not move away, he glanced up naturally and their eyes met for just a moment across maybe 30 yards of space and 2 strands of wire. He gave a single, brief nod, the kind of nod that says, "I see you," and nothing more than that. Then he looked back down at his wire. Ada dried her face on her sleeve and walked back to the barn. She did not know his name yet. She thought about asking someone in town, then decided that asking would reveal that she had been thinking about it, which felt like more than she wanted to give away. The following Wednesday, there were more wildflowers on the porch railing. This time she was home when they appeared, or nearly so. She had been in the barn dealing with Hester, who had been off her feed for 2 days and needed examination. When she came out of the barn into the afternoon light, she saw a figure moving away down the track that ran along the fence line, a man on horseback, already at some distance, not looking back. She could not have identified him with certainty, except that he was riding a gray horse with a distinctive high-stepping walk that she had seen before on Purdy's land. The flowers this time were different. Some she did not know the name of, small purple things with a sweet smell, and some orange ones and some white ones. Again tied with plain twine. Again no note. Ada picked them up. She stood on the porch and looked after the departing horseman, who was by now just a shape growing smaller against the big sky, and she felt that feeling again, the one she had not been able to name, and this time she recognized it a little more clearly. It was the feeling of being seen without being reached for. Every suitor who had come to her door had brought something to the proposition. Ned Farrow had brought his plans for her ranch. Hank Tillerman had brought his opinions about women and land. Carl Whiting had brought a ledger, practically speaking, with her assets neatly calculated. They had all arrived with an agenda which was not a crime but which had felt every time like a door being pressed against rather than knocked on. The wildflowers asked nothing. They were not a calling card or a petition. They were just wildflowers, left on a railing, and whoever had left them had already ridden away. Ada went inside and put the new flowers beside the old ones, which were still alive but fading, and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at them for a longer time than she would have admitted to anyone. She asked Leila Purdy in town the following Saturday. Leila was Jonah's Purdy's wife and came into town on Saturdays for supplies, and she and Ada had always been on decent terms, not close exactly, but the kind of friendly that comes from being neighboring women in a place where women look out for each other by necessity. She made the asking casual, which was harder than it looked. She said she had seen some of the Purdy hands working the fence line near her property, and wondered if Jonah's had taken on new men this season. Leila Purdy said yes, they'd brought on 5 new hands for the spring drive. Ada asked if any of them was riding a gray horse with that particular high-stepping way of going, and Leila said that sounded like Isaac Barker. "What do you know about him?" Ada asked and tried to make it sound idle. "Not a great deal," Leila said. "He is from Missouri, I believe. Jonah says he is the best hand he has hired in 2 seasons. Quiet man, keeps to himself, never any trouble." She paused and looked at Ada with the kind of gentle, knowing attention that married women of 35 develop for unmarried women of 24. "Why do you ask?" "No reason in particular," Ada said. "I just saw him on the fence line." Leila Purdy made a small sound that was not quite agreement and not quite skepticism and changed the subject, and Ada let the subject be changed. Isaac Barker, she had a name now. It did not change anything except that now when she thought about the gray horse and the quiet nod across the creek, she had something to attach the thought to. Isaac Barker. It was a plain, solid sort of name. It suited the way he had seemed from what she had seen of him. She did not go looking for him. She had too much to do and too much pride to go looking. And besides, some instinct told her that going looking would change the nature of the thing, whatever the thing was. The third Wednesday came and went without flowers, and Ada noticed the absence in a way that was so clear to her that she immediately became irritated with herself for noticing. She checked the porch railing in the morning, and at noon and again in the late afternoon, and there was nothing, and she told herself this was fine. This was expected. It had been a small thing, and now it was done, and she went to bed that night and did not sleep particularly well. On Thursday, she was repairing the garden fence. Rabbits had gotten in twice in the last 2 weeks, and she was replacing the lower boards with a finer mesh. And she heard a horse on the track and looked up, and there he was. He was riding the gray horse along the fence line at the boundary of the property, and he was carrying something across his saddle. He was not riding fast. When he saw her, he brought the gray to a halt and sat there for a moment with his hat in his hands. He had taken it off, which she noted, and looked at her across the distance between them. Ada straightened up from the garden fence and looked back at him. He nudged the gray forward at a walk until he reached the boundary fence, and Ada, after a brief hesitation that cost her something, walked toward him until she was close enough to talk without raising her voice. "Ma'am," he said. He had a quiet, careful voice. Not shy exactly, it was not the voice of a timid man, but measured, the way some people are when they have learned to think before they speak. "I am Isaac Barker. I work for Jonas Purdy. I apologize if I overstepped." Ada looked at him. He looked back at her without flinching, but also without the quality that some men had of looking at a woman as though she were a problem they were calculating how to solve. He looked at her the way he had looked at his fence wire, like something that deserved his real attention. "You left the flowers," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, not searching for a clever answer, she thought. Just being honest, which takes a moment sometimes. "I ride along this fence line most mornings," he said. "I have seen you working. I saw that there were wildflowers growing along the creek, and I thought you might appreciate them. I did not mean anything by it beyond that." "Most men mean something by it," Ada said. "I expect they do," he said, and did not add anything to it. She studied him. He had an open, angular face, the kind that the sun has treated honestly rather than harshly. He was not a handsome man in any polished way, but he had the quality that honest faces have of being better looking the longer you looked at them. "What do you want, Mr. Barker?" she asked. She asked it directly because she had found in her experience that directness saved everyone a great deal of time. He seemed to consider the question seriously. "I don't want anything from you," he said. "I just wanted you to have the flowers." She had been ready for a dozen answers. That one she had not been ready for. "That fence on the Purdy side needs the post driven back in," she said, which was the only thing she could think to say that was entirely practical and safe. "I can see it leaning from my garden." "I see it," he said. "I'll fix it this afternoon." "Good," she said. She went back to her garden fence. He rode on along the line. That was all of it, and somehow that was more than any visit any other man had paid her in 3 years. The next time she saw him was not on the fence line but in town, which felt different, less contained, more exposed. It was a Friday afternoon in late April, and the main street of Millhaven was busy in the way it always got at the end of the week, with ranch hands in from the surrounding spreads and farmers and their families and wagons at the rail, and the sound of boots on the boardwalk and voices from the saloon end of the street. Ada was coming out of the general store with a package under her arm when she nearly walked into him. He was going in. They both stopped, and there was the brief, ridiculous moment that happens when two people are in each other's way and both try to step in the same direction. "Sorry," he said. "No, she stepped back." He stepped back. They looked at each other, and Ada felt something tighten in her chest that was not unpleasant but was not entirely comfortable either. "How is your garden fence?" he asked. "Holding," she said. "How is the Purdy fence?" "Straight," he said. "I drove the post back in." "I saw," she said. "Thank you." There was a pause in which the street noise moved around them, and neither of them spoke, but neither of them moved to end the conversation either. "I heard there is a social next Saturday," he said, and then immediately looked as though he was uncertain whether saying that was going too far. It was an interesting thing to see on a man's face, not the performance of uncertainty but the actual thing. "Yes," Ada said. "Mrs. Ponder organizes it. She does one in spring and one in fall." "I haven't been to many socials," he said. "I move around enough that I usually miss them." "This is the first time you've stayed in one place long enough to catch one?" she asked. Something in his expression shifted slightly, not unhappy but aware of something. "Something like that," he said. Ada shifted the package under her arm. "Will you go?" she asked, and then wondered why she had asked that. "I don't know yet," he said, in a way that told her plainly he was thinking about whether she would be there and was not going to say so directly. "I usually go for an hour," she said. "Then I have to get back to see to my animals." "That makes sense," he said. She went past him into the store and he went on down the street, and Ada stood inside the door for a moment before she remembered she had already done her shopping and had been leaving. The spring social was held in the town hall, which was a plain wooden building that Mrs. Ponder's committee decorated with bunting and paper flowers, and which smelled of sawdust and beeswax candles, and the food that everyone brought. There was music. Old Jenkins from out on the Callaway Road played fiddle tolerably well, and his son played a battered guitar, and there was dancing, and there was food, and there were the inevitable small politics of who spoke to whom, and who stood where, and who danced with whom that the people of a small town conduct at these events with the intensity of diplomats. Ada arrived in a dress she rarely wore, which was blue-gray and had a small white collar, and she had her hair down, which she almost never had in public. She told herself this was not for any particular reason. She told herself this and was aware that she was lying to herself, but chose not to examine it too closely. She spoke with Leela Purdy. She spoke with the alderman girl, who was newly engaged to a farmer from the south of the county. She ate some of the potato salad that Mrs. Harker made, and that everyone agreed was the best potato salad in the county. She watched the dancing and declined, politely, an invitation to dance from Tom Schultz, who had apparently not given up hope entirely. She had been there 40 minutes, and she was beginning to think she had been foolish to think about the social in any particular way, when she saw Isaac Barker come through the door. He was clean, and his hair was combed, and he was wearing a good shirt that was not fancy but was honest, and he had clearly spent some effort on how he looked without trying to look like he had spent effort on it. He came in and stood just inside the door and looked around the room in the careful, attentive way he had, and when his eyes found hers, which they did in a way that suggested he had been looking for her, he did not look away quickly or look away at all. He made his way across the room, stopping to speak briefly to Jonas Purdy, and Ada waited where she was and watched him come and felt that tightening in her chest again, stronger this time. "Good evening," he said when he reached her. "Good evening, Mr. Barker," she said. "Isaac," he said, "if you don't mind." "Ada," she said, and it felt like giving something which surprised her because it was only her name. They stood beside each other and watched the dancing for a minute. Old Jenkins was playing a reel, and 3 couples were turning around the cleared center of the floor with varying degrees of coordination. "Do you dance?" he asked. "I used to," she said. "Before I was running the ranch by myself and came home too tired in the evenings." "That is a considerable amount of work for one person," he said. "Yes," she said, not with complaint but with simple agreement. "It is." "Do you want to try?" he asked, and nodded toward the dancers. He asked it without any performance, not with charm, not with bravado, just with genuine inquiry, as though dancing was a thing that might or might not be good, and he was curious what she thought. She looked at the floor. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, and surprised herself. "All right." He was not a graceful dancer. She had not expected him to be, but he was steady, and he paid attention, and he did not try to lead her in any direction she did not want to go, which was a quality she recognized immediately and valued in a way that went beyond dancing. They went around the floor twice, and she was laughing by the end of the second turn because they had nearly collided with the alderman girl and her intended, and had both had to do a comic sidestep. And Isaac had laughed too, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and it was a good sound. They went to the edge of the room and stood together, and the evening turned around them, and they talked. Not about anything of enormous consequence at first. They talked about the ranch and the cattle work. He told her about a horse on Purdy's spread that had a talent for getting through fences that no one could account for, and that Jonah's Purdy was at a loss to solve. She told him about the rabbit problem in the garden, and how she was considering getting a dog specifically to address it. He said a dog would probably help. She said she had been meaning to get one for 2 years. He said the best intentions often get postponed when there is always work to be done. "What made you come to Millhaven?" she asked. "The work was here," he said. Then, after a pause, "I have been moving around long enough that I was beginning to want to stay somewhere for a while. I don't know that Millhaven is the place, but I don't know that it isn't." "What would make it the place?" she asked. She did not mean it as a loaded question, but once she had asked it, she felt its weight. He looked at her for a moment in that careful, honest way. "I am not sure I know yet," he said, and there was something in how he said it that made the answer feel like it was about more than geography. Ada looked away first, out at the dancing couples, at the candles, at the bunting that Mrs. Ponder's committee had pinned along the rafters. The social noise was warm around them, and the fiddle was playing something slower now, a waltz of some kind, and the light was yellow and soft. "The flowers," she said, and then stopped. "Yes," he said. "Nobody has ever brought me flowers and asked nothing," she said, quietly enough that it was only for him. "Every man who has come to my door has wanted something, the ranch or a housekeeper or a solution to some problem they have. I am tired of being a solution to problems." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are not a solution. You are a person." It was simply said, without flourish, and because it was simply said it landed harder than any elaborate declaration would have. Ada looked at him, he looked back at her. "The flowers were just flowers," he said. "I will not pretend I wasn't thinking about you when I picked them, but I wasn't thinking I wanted something from you. I just thought you might like to have them." "How did you know?" she asked. "That I might like wildflowers." "I didn't," he said. "I just thought anyone who works as hard as you do alone might be glad of something that had no work attached to it." She was quiet for a long moment. Around them the social hummed. Somewhere outside someone laughed loudly at something. "I should get back," she said eventually. "My animals." "Of course," he said. She started to move toward the door and then stopped and turned back. "I ride along my own fence line on Sunday mornings," she said. "I check the condition of the wire and the posts. It takes about 2 hours." He looked at her steadily. "I will probably be doing something similar on Sunday morning," he said. "Well," she said, "the land is big, but the fence lines run close together in some places." "They do," he said. She went home and sat on her dark porch and looked at the stars for a long time, Hester moving in the pasture behind the house and the night insects singing. And she felt something that she had not felt in years, something quiet and warm and frighteningly hopeful. Sunday morning, she rode Copper along the fence line, and Isaac Barker was there on his gray horse on the Purdy side of the wire, doing exactly what he said he might be doing. And they rode parallel to each other at a comfortable distance, and talked across the fence for an hour about everything and nothing. And it was the best hour Ada could remember spending in a very long time. They talked about Missouri, which Isaac described without sentimentality but with affection, the rivers, the woods, the way winter came there differently than it did in Texas. They talked about the Brooks homestead and the challenges of running a mixed operation, cattle and kitchen garden and dairy cow alone. Isaac had opinions about cattle and about fencing and about the way drought years affected the grass, and his opinions were grounded and practical, not the opinions of someone who was trying to sound impressive, but of someone who had worked with these things long enough to understand them. He asked her about her father. "He was a good man," she said. "He worked hard all his life and he tried to build something that would last. I don't want to let it go. the land he built. I know it's hard, but I can't let it go. I understand that, Isaac said, and she believed him. Do you have family? She asked. A sister in Missouri, he said. We write when we can. Our parents died some years back. It is just the two of us. Are you close? As close as letters allow, he said, with a slight smile that was slightly sad, and she understood that distance is a kind of grief that never fully closes. They reached the corner where the fence turned and their parallel lines diverged, and they both brought their horses to a halt. I have extra fence wire, Ada said, if you need it. I noticed that section near the east corner is going to need replacing before summer. I'll mention it to Jonas, he said. Good, she said. They sat on their horses and looked at each other across the wire, and Ada thought about how strange it was that a fence could be both a line between two things and a place where two things met. Same time next Sunday, he asked. If the weather holds, she said. And if it doesn't? Then we're both wetter, but the fence still needs checking, she said, and nudged Copper toward home while he laughed behind her. Through May, the fence line rides became a regular thing, and so did the conversations, and so did the subtle recalibrating of Ada's sense of herself. She had lived for 2 years in a kind of deliberate self-containment, doing everything herself, accepting no help, forming no dependencies, because dependency was the thing she feared most, the thing that came when you let yourself need someone and then they were gone. Her father, her mother, 2 departures that had left her running as hard as she could toward the future because looking back was too painful. Isaac Barker did not ask her to stop running. He just rode alongside. In the second week of May, her milk cow Hester got out through a gap in the pasture fence that Ada had not yet gotten to and wandered half a mile down the road before anyone noticed. Ada spent 2 hours looking for her and found her standing peacefully in a meadow of new grass, and got her home, but then found that the gap in the fence was going to take more repair than she had materials for immediately. And by the time she had gotten Hester back in, and the fence roughly patched, it was getting dark and she was tired and frustrated, and her left hand had a cut across the palm from the wire that was not deep but was stinging. She sat on the porch in the last of the evening light, wrapping her hand with a strip of clean cloth, when she heard a horse on the track. She knew the sound of the gray horse's walk by now. She looked up, and Isaac Barker was riding toward the house, which he had not done before. They had always met at the fence line, not at her home. He pulled up a short distance away and looked at her hand. What happened? Fence wire, she said. Hester got out. I've patched it, but it needs more work. Let me look at the fence, he said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said simply. I'm offering. There was a difference, she had learned, between a man who offered in order to demonstrate that he was necessary and a man who offered because the help was genuinely useful. She had gotten good at telling the difference. She looked at him and said, All right. The gap is on the south side, near the old elm. He put his gray horse in the paddock beside Copper and spent an hour in the near dark fixing her fence with her materials and his tools and his knowledge of wire. And Ada, after sitting on the porch long enough to make it clear she was not hovering, went inside and made coffee and brought him a cup when he came back. They sat on the porch in the full dark, the coffee hot between their hands, and the night around Millhaven was very quiet, the kind of quiet that settles on the land when the day's work is done, and the animals are still, and the stars are particular and bright. Tell me something about you that nobody around here knows, Ada said. He thought about it. I was nearly a school teacher, he said. She looked at him, surprised. How nearly? I studied for 2 years in Missouri, he said. Before my father died and I needed to work, I liked it, the books, the work of trying to explain things so that someone else understands them. And instead you became a cowboy, she said. Life has its own ideas, he said without bitterness. Do you miss it? She asked. The teaching. Sometimes I miss what it might have been, he said. But I don't know that I would trade what I have. I have seen more of this country than most men will ever see. There is something in that. There is, she agreed. He looked out at the dark land and then at her. In the dim light from the house, his face was very still and very clear. What do you miss? He asked. She had not expected to be asked. She sat with it for a moment. "I miss my mother," she said. "She used to sit exactly here on this porch in the evenings. She used to say that the best part of a day was the end of it when you could see what you had done with it." She paused. "I miss having someone to tell the end of a day to." He nodded. He did not say anything falsely comforting. He just sat with what she had said. After a while he said, "You can tell me." She looked at him. "The end of today," he said. "You fixed a fence in the dark. You found your cow, you cut your hand. That is what you did with today." She felt something move in her chest. "Yes," she said, "that is what I did with today." "That is a good day's work," he said. "What did you do with your day?" she asked. "I ran 3 strays back to the south pasture," he said. "I repaired 2 sections of fence on the creek side, and then I rode over here and drank your coffee and fixed your fence, which was the best part." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Isaac." "Yes." "I am very careful with people," she said. "I want you to know that. It is not that I don't." She stopped and tried again. "I am not good at needing people. I have had to learn not to. So I am slow." "I know," he said. "Do you have patience for slow?" she asked. "I have patience for you specifically," he said, and said it like it was the most uncomplicated thing in the world. She looked out at the dark. The stars were extraordinary the way they got when there was no moon. The cattle were quiet. Hester was back in her pasture. The fence was mended. "You should get back," she said. "Jonas will need you early tomorrow." "He will," Isaac said. He stood and put his hat on and walked to the paddock and got his horse, and she watched from the porch as he rode down the track and turned onto the road. And she sat for a long time after he was gone, looking at the stars and the mended night. June came in hard and hot the way June always did in that part of Texas, the sky bleaching white at midday and the grass going yellow at the tips and the creek dropping to a ribbon. Ada worked the land through the heat in the early mornings and the late afternoons, and rested through the worst of the noon hours, which was the only sensible strategy. On the 14th of June, she rode into Millhaven and found the town in a small state of agitation. There had been trouble at the Hanrahan Ranch, west of town. A man calling himself a land agent had arrived with what he claimed were legal documents proving that Hanrahan's title to his land was defective, and he was demanding that Hanrahan vacate in 30 days. Hanrahan, who had been on his land for 12 years and had a family and no money for lawyers, was at the general store demanding to know if anyone had heard of the man, whose name was Greer. Ada knew what this was. She had read about it in the newspaper that came occasionally from San Antonio land speculators moving through the frontier counties, using questionable legal claims and the general confusion of land records from the Republic of Texas days to push small holders off land that was becoming more valuable as the railroads pushed west. It was not violent, usually, but it was ruthless. And it was legal, more or less, which made it worse. She listened to Hanrahan in the general store and felt something hot and familiar, the anger that comes from watching injustice be conducted with paperwork. "When did this Greer arrive?" she asked. 2 days ago, Hanrahan said. He was a thick, red-faced man who was ordinarily calm but was now clearly frightened, which was hard to watch. "He showed me papers. I can't read them well enough to know what they say." "Let me read them," Ada said. He looked at her with some surprise. She was not a lawyer, but he pulled the papers from his coat, and she read them carefully, right there in the general store, with the attention she had developed for the documents her father had taught her to understand. Her father had been a careful man about land titles. He had shown her everything. "These reference the original land grant from the Republic," she said, "but the survey notation is wrong. I can see that the boundary reference doesn't match any river landmark I know from that part of the county. And this signature," she squinted. "I don't know who signed as witness here, but the notarization is from Austin. You need to send to Austin for verification." "I can't afford a lawyer," Hanrahan said. "You don't need a lawyer for a letter," Ada said. "You need to write to the General Land Office in Austin and ask for verification of your original title against this document. Send it today, and don't let this man push you anywhere until you hear back." She spent an hour helping Hanrahan compose the letter. She did not know if it would be enough. But she knew that the best weapon against fraudulent paperwork was more paperwork, and that men like Greer counted on people being too scared or too tired to fight them on their own terms. She told Isaac about it on the fence line the following Sunday. "I've seen it before," he said, his jaw tight. "In Kansas, men like that following the development west. It's not new." "The land office letter may not be enough," Ada said. "Hanrahan needs someone who can read legal documents to sit with him through whatever comes next. Do you know someone?" "I know the county judge," she said. "He's a fair man. I'll ask him to look at the papers. He may not be able to do much officially, but his opinion will carry weight." She paused. "In the meantime, I told Hanrahan to let it be known that the letter has been sent and that the title is being verified. Men like Greer don't want legal scrutiny. They want people who will leave quietly." Isaac looked at her with an expression that she could not entirely read, but that felt like respect. "You are remarkable," he said, and said it not as flattery but as a plain observation, the way he said most things. She felt warmth rise in her face. "I am practical," she said. "It is the same thing sometimes." As it happened, the Greer matter was resolved faster than expected. The county judge had, on his own initiative, reviewed the papers and found several irregularities, and had sent word to Austin himself, and Greer, who was indeed a land speculator operating a scheme that had been run in 3 other counties, had departed Millhaven before the end of June, presumably to try his luck elsewhere. Hanrahan came to find Ada at the general store and gripped her hand, and thanked her with a sincerity that she found both moving and slightly embarrassing, because she had only done what seemed obvious to do. She told Isaac about it on a Sunday in late June, and he smiled the slow, warm smile that had become her favorite sight in the world and said, "I did not doubt it for a moment." "I didn't do that much," she said. "Ada," he said, "you did everything." The summer deepened. The cattle drive came in July and took Isaac away from Purdy's for 3 weeks, driving a herd north toward the rail junction at Abilene, and those 3 weeks had a quality that Ada was embarrassed to examine too closely, a kind of dimness, as though the light was ordinary rather than remarkable, as though the days were complete but not full. She received one letter from him. He wrote in a plain, clear hand and said that the drive was going well, that the cattle were behaving, that he had seen a river bend in the evening that reminded him of something she had told him about her mother watching sunsets from the porch, and that he hoped she was well and that Hester had stayed in her pasture. He did not use words like miss or want, but she read the letter 3 times and understood it completely. She wrote back to the address he had left her, at a general store in the junction town, and told him about the garden, which was producing more tomatoes than she could use, and about a young hawk she had been watching build a nest in the cottonwood near the creek, and about the heat, and about Hester, who had stayed in her pasture. She did not use words like miss or want either, but she thought he would understand it. He came back in the 3rd week of July, leaner and darker from the weeks on the trail, and rode to her fence line on the Sunday of his return, and she was already there. And when she saw him coming, she knew that the dimness of the past 3 weeks had been about his absence, and she decided, in that moment, watching him ride toward her with his easy way in the saddle, that she was done being careful, not careless. Ada Brooks did not do careless, but she was done treating hope like a thing to be rationed. "Welcome back," she said when he reached the fence. "Thank you," he said. He looked at her in a way that was new and not new more direct, as though the 3 weeks apart had clarified something for him as well. "I have something to ask you," he said. "All right," she said. "There is nothing transactional in this question," he said, with the careful honesty she had come to love. "I want to be clear about that before I ask it. I am not asking because of the ranch or because you need something or because I do. I am asking only because I would like to know you better and I would like you to have the choice clearly." "Isaac," she said, "ask the question." "Would you have dinner with me?" he said. "Not on a fence line, at a proper table. In town, if you prefer, or wherever is comfortable for you." She looked at him. The summer sun was high and the light was flat and bright, and somewhere above them the hawk she had been watching turned on the air, and the world was very large and very still. "Come to the house," she said. "Sunday, I'll cook. You bring the flowers." The smile that crossed his face then was the best thing she had seen in years. He came on Sunday with a bundle of wildflowers that was larger than any of the previous ones. He had clearly spent some time selecting them, and she had cooked a proper meal: roasted chicken from the flock, new potatoes from the garden, green beans, corn bread. She put the flowers in the big canning jar in the center of the table, and they sat across from each other in the kitchen of the house her father had built, and ate and talked for 3 hours. They talked about everything. About what Ada wanted for the future of the ranch. She had thoughts about a larger cattle operation, about possibly leasing the south pasture to another rancher for a share of the profits, about whether to put in a windmill pump to deal with the water problem in dry years. Isaac listened and responded with the attentiveness of a man who was genuinely interested in her plans rather than in correcting them. He talked about what he wanted. He was careful here, honest but careful. He said he was 30 years old and he had been moving all his life, and he was beginning to want to stop. He said he did not know exactly what stopping looked like for him, but he thought it probably looked like having land, which he did not have, and work that was his own, which he had never had. He said he was a man with skills but without property, and he said this without shame but with honesty. "Do you intend to keep working for Purdy?" she asked. "Through the fall," he said. "After that I don't know. Purdy has no permanent place for me. He keeps hands for the drive season, and then some of them stay on and some move." "What would you do if you stayed in Millhaven?" she asked. "I would look for land to work," he said, "or a situation where I could work toward having some of my own." She looked at the wildflowers in the jar on the table. The afternoon light was coming through the west window, and the flowers were very vivid in it, the purples and oranges and yellows of the summer prairie. "My south pasture," she said slowly, as though thinking aloud. "It's good land. I've been running it light because I can only manage so much alone. But it could support a proper herd." He was very still. "If a person were to work that pasture," she said, still looking at the flowers, "for a fair wage and a share of what it produced, over time they might build something there." "Ada," he said, and his voice had changed. She looked at him. "I am not offering you charity," she said. "I am offering you a proposition that is good for both of us. The ranch needs more working. I cannot do it alone. You need a place to work towards something. Those two things fit together." "I know they do," he said. "That is not why I am looking at you like this." "How are you looking at me?" she asked, though she could see perfectly well how he was looking at her. "Like I'm trying to understand how it is that I ended up on this fence line at this time," he said, "and whether I have any right to what I feel when I am near you." She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was very quiet except for the wind and the distant sound of cattle. "I am going to say something," she said, "and I want you to know that I have never said this to anyone, so I may say it awkwardly." "Go ahead," he said. "I have spent 2 years being afraid of needing anyone," she said. "I thought being alone was the same as being safe. And then you came along and left flowers on my porch and asked nothing, and I realized that I had confused the cost of losing someone with the cost of having them, and that those are not the same thing at all." He was looking at her with an expression that was very open and a little undone. "What I am saying," she said, "is that I trust you, which is," she took a breath, "which is not a thing I give easily. But I trust you, and I think you might be exactly who I think you are, and that is not nothing." He stood up from the table and came around it, and she stood too, and he was very close, closer than he had ever been, and he put his hand up and touched her face very gently, just her cheek, with his thumb. "You are the most extraordinary person I have ever known," he said, "and I have been in love with you since the first Sunday you rode out to that fence line and asked me if I had patience for Slow." She put her hand over his. "You said you had patience for me specifically," she said. "I meant it," he said. She kissed him. She had to reach up slightly because he was taller, and she had one hand at his collar and the other at his chest, and the kitchen light was golden, and the wildflowers were on the table, and outside the Texas summer was going on with all its ordinary magnificence. and she felt, in the fullest possible way, that she had come to the right place after a very long journey. He stayed until the evening, until the light was gone and Hester needed seeing too, and they sat on the porch in the dark as they had before, but differently now, with his shoulder against hers and her hand in his, and they talked about the future in a way that felt for the first time not frightening but full. He went back to Purdy's that night, and she went to bed with her heart so light she could not sleep, and she lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and smiled like a woman who has just learned something she had been afraid to learn, and found it was not what she feared at all. August was a different world from what had come before it. There is a quality to a summer when you are in love that is distinct from any other kind of summer. The heat is still the heat, and the work is still the work, but there is a particular brightness to the ordinary things, a particular texture to the days. Ada moved through her work with the same steadiness she had always had, but the work felt different. It felt like it was part of something rather than simply the day's requirement. Isaac came to the ranch on Sundays now by invitation, and sometimes on evenings when his work at Purdy's was done early enough. He brought her things, not grand things, never grand things. He brought her a jar of honey from a farm east of town that kept bees. He brought her a new pair of fence pliers because he had noticed hers were worn. He brought her a book from the general store's small collection, a novel from back east, which he said he thought she might like and which she did. He brought Wildflowers always, each week a different combination of whatever the prairie offered. She gave things back. She cooked for him as often as he came. She told him things about herself she had not told anyone, about the night her mother died and the way the house had felt afterward, about the particular loneliness of being a person who does not want sympathy but needs to be known. He listened to all of it. He was, she had come to understand, one of those rare people who listens not to respond but to understand, and being understood was, she found, the thing she had wanted most and never known how to ask for. He had talked to Jonas Purdy by the end of August. He told Ada about it on a Sunday afternoon, sitting on her porch in the shade with lemonade that she had made. "Jonas says he has no permanent place for me after the fall," Isaac said. "He knew I was going to look for something else. He wished me well. He's a fair man." "He is," Ada said. "I've been thinking about your offer," he said. "About the south pasture." "What have you been thinking about it?" she asked. "That it's a good offer," he said. "That the arrangement makes sense and that the land is good and that I think I could make something real of it in a few years' time. That the whole idea of it," he said and paused, "is complicated by the fact that I love you and I don't want there to be confusion between what I want from the land and what I want from you because they are separate things." She looked at him. "Isaac," she said, "I know the difference. I'm not confused about your intentions." "I know you know," he said. "I just wanted to be clear myself. I want to be useful to you in this work, and separately I want to ask you something." "All right," she said. He reached into his coat pocket and took out something small and held it in his palm toward her. It was a ring. Not an expensive ring, it was plain silver, with a small piece of blue stone set simply in it, the color of the Texas sky on a clear day. He had not gotten it from a jeweler in a city. She could see it was handmade carefully by someone who knew metalwork. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "A man in town does metalwork," he said. "I described what I wanted and he made it. I asked him to make it with a stone the color of your eyes." She looked at it. She looked at him. "Ada Brooks," he said. "I am a man with no land and no family name of great importance, and I cannot promise you anything grand. But I can promise you that I will work beside you and not in front of you. I can promise you that I will listen and I will try to understand and I will never mistake you for anything less than what you are. And I can promise you that whatever years I have, I want to spend them knowing you. So I am asking, with nothing in exchange that you do not choose freely to give, whether you will marry me." She had told herself she would wait. She had told herself she would consider it carefully, with the same deliberation she gave every major decision, which was how she had been raised and how she had lived. She had told herself she would not be rushed by feeling. She said yes before he had finished the question. She said it quietly and clearly, in the same tone in which she said everything that was true, and then she laughed because the relief of saying it was so enormous that laughing seemed like the only appropriate response. And he laughed too, and he put the ring on her finger, and she held her hand up in the afternoon light and looked at it. It fit perfectly. She asked him how he knew the size. He said he had measured a piece of string to her finger one evening in August when she was asleep and he thought she would not notice. And she stared at him and said, "Isaac Barker," and he said, "I was patient as promised." And she kissed him again, right there on the porch in the afternoon light, Hester visible in the pasture behind the house, the Texas sky enormous and unperturbed above them. They married in October, when the worst of the summer heat was done, and the light had the particular golden quality it gets in the southern fall. The wedding was held at the Methodist Church in Millhaven, because it was the largest space in town that could hold the guests that, somewhat to Ada's surprise, turned out to be numerous. She had thought of herself as a solitary figure, but the town, it seemed, had more affection for her than she had credited. Mrs. Ponder came and brought her remarkable potato salad. Leila Purdy came and hugged Ada in the churchyard and whispered, "I knew when you asked me about the gray horse." Jonas Purdy came and gave Isaac his hand, and said he expected him to do well for himself, which was about as effusive as Jonas Purdy got. The Hanrahans came, all 6 of them, and Dan Hanrahan gripped Ada's hand the way he had in the general store, and said she had done them a good turn and they would not forget it. Old Jenkins played fiddle at the reception in the town hall afterward, and they danced, Ada and Isaac, better than they had at the spring social because they had been practicing, and the room was full of the warm noise of a community celebrating a thing it approved of. Isaac was wearing a good suit he had bought from the dry goods store, and Ada was wearing a dress that had been her mother's white cotton with eyelet trim, taken in at the waist by Mrs. Alderman, who had a talent for such things, and the blue stone ring was on her finger and caught the candlelight when she raised her hand. They spent the first night as a married couple in the house her father had built, and in the morning Ada made breakfast and they ate it together at the kitchen table where the wildflower jar sat, still full, and the light came in through the west window, and the ranch waited around them, familiar and enormous and full of possibility. The fall and winter of that first year were a building time. Isaac moved his few belongings from Purdy's bunkhouse to the homestead and established himself in the work with the quiet competence that was his nature. He took on the management of the cattle with the expertise of a man who knew cattle, and the herd began to thrive in a way that it had not in the years Ada had been managing it alone. Not because she had done it wrong, she had done it as well as one person could, but because 2 people who understood their work could do more than one. He built a proper milking stall for Hester, which improved everyone's morning considerably. He repaired the barn roof, which had been worrying Ada for a year. He put in the windmill pump that Ada had been thinking about, bringing water to the east pasture, which meant the cattle could graze further without stress in the dry months. He was not a man who needed to announce these accomplishments. He simply did them, and Ada saw them done and understood what they meant, and they did not keep score between them because there was no score to keep. She got the dog she had been meaning to get for 2 years, a brown and white cow dog of no particular breed but good sense, which she named Jasper. Jasper solved the rabbit problem in the garden completely, and became attached to Isaac with the slavish devotion that working dogs develop for the person who works them most, which amused Ada considerably. The south pasture went into production the following spring. Isaac worked it alongside the main herd, building it methodically, buying young stock when there was money and culling carefully, and by the end of the second year it was a genuine operation. He was not wealthy from it. They were not wealthy from any of it. But the ranch was producing, the land was good, and they were building something together that felt, to both of them, like a thing that would last. In the spring of 1880, Ada realized she was expecting. She told Isaac on a Sunday morning in April, standing in the kitchen with the door open and the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of Jasper in the yard. and she was not afraid, which surprised her slightly, because she had always thought she might be afraid. He put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her with an expression so full of feeling that she had to look away for a moment, not because it was too much, but because it was exactly the right amount, and she wanted to hold it carefully. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling well?" "I am fine," she said. "I am very well." "I am," he started and then stopped and tried again. "I don't have words for what I am feeling," he said. "You don't need words," she said. He put his arms around her and held her there in the kitchen in the spring morning, and she felt his heart going fast against her shoulder, and she thought about her mother sitting on the porch at the end of days, and about her father building this house with his hands, and about wildflowers on a railing, and about how the world turns in ways that are sometimes, against all expectation, precisely right. The summer of 1880 was the hottest in 5 years. Ada worked at a modified pace through the worst of it, with Isaac redirecting the heavier tasks to himself, without making a fuss about it in a way she appreciated enormously, because she was not a woman who accepted being treated as less than capable, and he understood this well enough by now to navigate it with care. She rode copper through July, carefully, on the gentler ground. She managed the kitchen garden. She wrote letters. She had continued helping Hanrahan with various land document questions that arose from the Greer incident's complications, and had become something of an informal resource for neighbors who had questions about land records and titles. She had good working knowledge of it now, and she used it freely. Isaac wrote to his sister in Missouri and told her about the baby coming and the ranch and the life they were building. His sister, whose name was Caroline, wrote back a letter that Ada read with Isaac at the kitchen table, and it was warm and full of genuine joy, and she said she hoped to visit someday when the railroad made it easier, and Ada wrote back and told her she was welcome. The baby came in December of 1880, a boy, born on a cold, clear night with the stars very bright outside the window and Mrs. Alderman in attendance as the midwife. He was a strong, large baby who arrived with considerable opinion about his situation, and who settled into the world with the healthy appetite of a person who intends to make the most of it. They named him Calvin, for Ada's father. Calvin Isaac Barker. Ada held him in the December light of the bedroom and looked at his red, furious, magnificent face, and felt the world rearrange itself around this new fact. Isaac sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the boy with an expression Ada had never seen on any human face before and could not name precisely, except that it was the look of a man whose life had just become entirely different and who is grateful for it in a way that goes too deep for expression. "Calvin," he said very quietly to the baby. The baby looked up at the ceiling. "I know," Isaac said. "It is a lot to take in." Ada laughed, tired and enormous and completely, entirely happy. By the spring of 1881, Calvin was growing in the healthy, rapid way of ranch babies, and the Brooks Barker homestead was becoming a full, busy, productive place. The windmill turned over the east pasture. The south pasture herd was 60 head and growing. Jasper was aging into a dignified middle-aged dog who had trained 3 of Ada's barn cats to tolerate him. The kitchen garden was producing better than ever, which Ada attributed to better soil management, and which Isaac attributed to the fact that she talked to the plants, which she denied. They had been married nearly 3 years, and Ada had noticed that the quality of her days had changed in a way she had not entirely anticipated. She had expected to love him. She did love him deeply, with the kind of love that is built from real knowledge of a person and is therefore sturdier than the dramatic varieties. She had expected the partnership to be good. It was more than good. It was the kind of complementary collaboration where 2 people's different skills cover each other's gaps so naturally that the whole is substantially larger than its parts. What she had not expected was the extraordinary ordinariness of the happiness. She had somehow thought, in the years before, that love, if she ever found it, would feel like a constant state of wonder. It did contain wonder. But mostly, it felt like waking up and having coffee at the same table as someone who was glad to see you. It felt like looking up from the garden to see a man walking toward you with a baby on his hip and a look on his face that says this is enough, exactly this. It felt like being known so well that you did not have to explain yourself, ever, to anyone, because at least one person in the world understood you from the inside out. She told him this one evening in the fall of 1881, sitting on the porch with Calvin asleep in the house, and the stars beginning to appear and the ranch quiet around them. He considered it in the way he always considered things. Then he said, "My sister wrote to me when we first married. She said that happiness is not a state you achieve and then keep, it's something you choose every day. I didn't know what she meant when I read it, I think I know now." "What does she mean?" Ada asked. "She means that this," he gestured at the porch, "the dark land, the ranch, the sleeping child inside, is not luck exactly. It is what you get when you choose someone worth choosing and keep choosing them." Ada looked at his profile in the dim light. "I choose you," she said, "for the record." "I know," he said. "I choose you for the record." They sat there for a while longer, not needing to say anything else. In the spring of 1882, Caroline Barker, Isaac's sister, came to visit. She had been able to travel by train as far as the junction, and had hired a stage coach from there, and arrived in Millhaven dusty and cheerful, and enormously glad to see her brother, whom she had not seen in 4 years. She was 26, with Isaac's same dark eyes and his same quality of attentive stillness, and she and Ada took to each other within the first afternoon in the way that women sometimes do when they are genuinely suited directly, without the performance of friendliness. She stayed for 6 weeks, and during those 6 weeks the homestead was more alive than it had ever been. Calvin, who was 18 months old and full of a toddler's inexhaustible energy, developed an immediate and consuming devotion to his Aunt Caroline that she reciprocated entirely. Isaac showed his sister the ranch with a pride that was quiet but clearly real. The windmill, the south pasture herd, the barn with its repaired walls, the kitchen garden where Ada was already putting in the early plants. One afternoon when Isaac was out with the cattle, Caroline sat with Ada on the porch and said, "He wrote to me about you before he asked you to marry him. He wrote and said he had met a woman who ran her own land and had turned down every man who came to her, and that he had brought her wildflowers and she had looked at him like she was trying to decide whether he was real. He said he had never met anyone so remarkable." Ada looked out at the land. "He brought me flowers and asked nothing," she said. "It was the first time anyone had ever done that." "He has always been like that," Caroline said. "He gives without calculating." "He always has. I think he was waiting for someone who understood that because most people don't." "I understand it," Ada said. "I know you do," Caroline said. "That's exactly why you're the right person." Caroline returned to Missouri in late spring, with promises to come again and with letters already begun for the journey, and the homestead settled back into its rhythms, richer for having been expanded briefly. The following year, in the early spring of 1883, Ada told Isaac she was expecting again. He received this news with the same overwhelming, inarticulate joy he had shown the first time, and added to it an increased and careful attentiveness that she found touching and occasionally maddening in equal measure, because she was still Ada Brooks, who had been running land alone for 2 years, and being treated as though she might break was not something she adjusted to easily. She told him this, and he apologized and continued doing it, and she loved him for it. Their daughter arrived in October of 1883, on a cooler, more cooperative day than Calvin's dramatic December entrance. She was smaller and considerably calmer than her brother had been, and she looked at the world from her first moments with an expression of serious appraisal that Ada recognized as her own. They named her Marguerite, for Ada's mother. Marguerite Eleanor Barker, with her mother's gray-green eyes and her father's dark hair, and she grew into an observant, thoughtful child who watched everything before she engaged with it, which was a trait her parents recognized without surprise. With Calvin in his 4th year and the baby in her first, The homestead was full in a way that was sometimes overwhelming and always, underneath the exhaustion, deeply right. Jasper the dog, now elderly and stiff but emotionally indestructible, had appointed himself guardian of the children with the dignity of a creature who has found his final and truest purpose. He lay near Calvin while he played and near the cradle while Marguerite slept, and regarded both small persons with an expression of solemn responsibility that made Isaac laugh every time he saw it. The ranch in those years was doing genuinely well. The South pasture herd was over 100 head, and Isaac had bought, from Jonas Purdy, who was reducing his own operation, a parcel of 20 acres that adjoined the pasture on the east, which he purchased with the accumulated profit from 3 years of good cattle work, and which became, for him, the first land he had ever owned in his life. He held the deed in his hands and looked at it for a long time, standing in the kitchen of the house that had been Calvin Brooks's and that was now his, and Ada watched his face and understood everything that was on it. "This is yours," she said. "It is ours," he said. "It is yours," she said again gently. "Whatever is mine is ours. But this, you built this, you bought this is yours." He looked at the deed. He looked at her. He said, "I am going to put up a gate on the east side with a name on it." "Barker," she said. "Brooks Barker," he said. She felt something move in her chest. "All right," she said. "That will do." The gate went up in the spring of 1885, a good solid wooden gate with the words carved into the crosspiece by the same craftsman in town who had made Ada's ring, Brooks Barker. It marked the entrance to the combined property that was now 160 acres. The original homestead plus the south pasture plus Isaac's 20 acres, and it stood at the end of the track that led up from the road, visible from a good distance in any direction. The morning it went up, Ada stood in front of it with Calvin, who was 4 and very interested in the gate and wanted to swing on it, and Isaac beside her with Marguerite on his hip, and the April morning was cool and the bluebonnets were out along the track, and everything smelled of grass and turned earth. "Your grandfather built this place," Ada said to Calvin, who was already reaching for the gate. "And your grandmother kept it, and your father made it grow, and someday it will be yours and your sister's and you will take care of it." Calvin swung on the gate. "Can Jasper come?" he asked. "Jasper is already here," Isaac said, and nodded at the elderly dog who was sitting 10 feet away watching the proceedings with dignified disapproval of anyone swinging on gates. Ada laughed and Isaac laughed, and Calvin swung harder on the gate, and Marguerite made a sound of approval or complaint. It was hard to tell with Marguerite. She had opinions but expressed them sparingly, and the morning went on around them, bright and ordinary and immeasurably full. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Ada and Isaac sat on the porch in the way they always had, from the very beginning. It was the constant thread in the days, the end of the day, the porch, the dark land, the talk. They talked about the ranch. They talked about the children. They talked about what they were reading because they both read and traded books back and forth and had opinions. They talked about the things they heard from neighbors and from the newspaper and from Caroline's letters. The world beyond Millhaven was moving in its large, complicated ways. The railroads were pushing further west, and the frontier was changing, towns growing, the open range being fenced, the way of life that the Longhorn drives represented becoming something that would not last another generation. Isaac talked about this without sentimentality but with awareness. He said the ranch would need to adapt, and he had ideas about how. They planted an orchard on the north side of the house in 1886 peach trees, and one apple tree that the nursery man in town said might not thrive in the Texas heat, but was worth trying. The peach trees were an immediate success. The apple tree was a slow triumph, taking 3 years to produce fruit, but eventually doing so with a stubbornness that they both found appropriate. The Suitors were a story that the town still told, occasionally, with the fond exaggeration that small towns apply to their own histories. Ada had refused 7 men, and then a cowboy had brought her wildflowers and asked nothing, and now look. The Brooks Barker place was the most productive operation in the county, and the woman who had refused every reasonable offer had built something with a quiet man that none of the reasonable offers could have matched. Ada heard this version of the story from Mrs. Ponder's daughter-in-law in 1887, retold at a church picnic, and came home and told Isaac, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Is that how it happened?" "More or less," she said. "I always thought you were the one who built something," he said. "I just had the good sense to bring flowers." "You did more than bring flowers," she said. "Yes," he said, "but the flowers were the important part." She thought about that. She thought about the bundle of bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush and yellow prairie coneflowers on the porch railing, on a Wednesday in April of 1878, tied with plain twine, left without a note, asking nothing. She thought about standing on the porch with them in her hands and feeling seen without being reached for, and how that had been the thing she had needed without knowing she needed it. "Yes," she said, "the flowers were the important part." He took her hand and she let him hold it, and the evening came on around them, Millhaven in the distance and the ranch close, the animals settled and the children sleeping inside and the land dark and breathing all around the house, and the stars coming out one by one over Texas in the way they always had, before any of them were there, patient and vast and entirely indifferent to whether anyone was watching, except that it was better when someone was. Calvin grew into a boy who was his grandfather in everything except his eyes, which were his father's, attentive, brown, and honest. He was energetic and bold in the way of physical children, but had, under the boldness, a thoughtfulness that showed itself in the questions he asked. He wanted to know how everything worked. He followed Isaac around the ranch from the time he could walk with sufficient steadiness to be trusted among the cattle, and Isaac taught him with the patience of a man who takes teaching seriously, answering questions fully and without condescension, which Calvin repaid by remembering everything he was told and asking the follow-up question. Marguerite was the quieter of the two, but not the lesser. She watched everything before she acted on it, and when she acted she was precise. She had Ada's love of reading and her father's love of how things worked, and combined the two in a way that was her own. She was, by the time she was 7, reading whatever she could get her hands on, including the agricultural pamphlets that came occasionally from the land-grant college in Austin, which she reported on to Isaac with the air of someone conducting a very small professional consultation. Isaac, who had once nearly been a school teacher, was delighted by this. He wrote to the land-grant college on her behalf and requested more materials, and the pamphlets arrived regularly after that, and Marguerite read them and discussed them and 2 of her suggestions, one about soil rotation and one about a new variety of corn, went into practice on the ranch and worked as described. Ada watched all of this with a full heart. Not a perfect heart. Life on the frontier had never promised perfection and never delivered it. There were hard years. In 1888, there was a drought that was severe enough to reduce the herd and empty the creek almost entirely, and strain the finances to their thinnest point. They got through it with the windmill, which had been Isaac's foresight and which never stopped producing water even when the creek was dust, and with the careful management they had learned in the better years to apply against the worse ones. They got through it together, which was the important thing. There were smaller losses. Jasper died in the winter of 1887, old and peaceful, in the warmth of the barn, and Calvin and Marguerite both wept, and Ada and Isaac buried him under the cottonwood by the creek where the hawk had nested in the spring of 1878, which seemed right. A young dog came to replace him the following spring. A black and white one, Calvin, named Chief, who was Jasper's opposite in every behavioral way, energetic where Jasper had been dignified, chaotic where Jasper had been orderly, but who turned out to be an excellent cattle dog, and who grew, over years, into a dependable member of the household. Caroline came to visit again in 1889, this time staying for 3 months, And this time she brought a man, a quiet, kind schoolteacher named Henry, who looked at Caroline with the same quality of attention that Isaac had always given Ada, and whom Ada recognized immediately and approved of on the spot. She told Isaac this later. He said he had noticed the same thing. They sat on the porch and discussed it with the private satisfaction of two people who believe that good things should happen to good people and who have some evidence for it. Caroline and Henry married the following year in Missouri, and wrote to say that they expected a child in the spring of 1891, and Ada and Isaac wrote back with joy and with the particular authority of people who have been through it and know exactly what it means. The children grew. The ranch grew. The world changed around it. The frontier closed, as it had been closing for years, and the great open range of the cattle drive era gave way to fenced land and settled agriculture, and the cowboys who had ridden the long drives became working ranch hands on fixed operations. The changes came slowly enough that they could be adapted to, and Isaac adapted with the practicality of a man who had always understood that the land does not stay the same and neither do the people who work it. By the mid-1890s, Millhaven had grown considerably. A new school had been built, and a bank, and a second general store. The railroad junction was close enough to matter. The Brooks Barker Ranch was established and respected, known in the county for consistent cattle, and for the woman who had, people still said, built it up from nothing while running it alone, and for her husband who had come from Missouri with skills and quiet and very good judgment. Ada, in her early 40s, had the life she had built. She was not soft from it. She was still the woman who got up at first light and could fix a fence and read a land document and manage a negotiation. But she was also the woman who sat on the porch in the evenings with a man she loved completely, and who had 2 children growing into people she was enormously proud of, and who could look at the land around her and see, in every piece of it, the work of people she had loved: her father's house, her mother's porch, Isaac's south pasture gate, Calvin's handwriting on the fence post count, Marguerite's corn in the north field. She still got wildflowers sometimes. Not every week, not any fixed schedule, but in the spring especially, when the bluebonnets came up along the creek and the Indian paintbrush turned the fence lines orange and pink, she would sometimes find a bundle on the porch railing in the morning, tied with plain twine, no note. Isaac never made a production of it. It was just a thing he did, the way some men bring coffee in the morning without being asked, because it is the form that care takes when it has been practiced long enough to become instinct. One April morning in 1896, when the spring was as good as the spring of 1878 had been, Ada came out to the porch and found the flowers on the railing: bluebonnets and paintbrush and yellow prairie coneflower, as though the years had not moved, and stood with them in her hands and thought about that first time, when she had not known who left them or why. She heard the door behind her, and Isaac came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one and stood beside her and looked at the morning land. "You remembered," she said, nodding at the flowers. "I always remember what kind of flowers they were the first time," he said. "Why?" He looked at her. He looked at her in the way he always had, like she was worth his real attention, like she was a person rather than a proposition, like she was the most interesting thing in the world to him, which she believed him about because she knew him well enough by now to know when he meant something, and he always meant this. "Because that was the beginning," he said. "I like to remember beginnings." She looked at the flowers in her hand and at the land stretching out before them, and at the gate at the end of the track with Brooks Barker carved in it, and at the smoke beginning to rise from the kitchen chimney where Calvin, home from school for the summer, was apparently up early and making coffee of his own because he was 16 now and thought he was a man and in some ways already was. "It was a good beginning," she said. "It was the best beginning," he said, and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood there on the porch of the house her father built and her mother loved, and she had fought to keep, and they had built together. And the spring morning came on over Texas in all its bright, indifferent, magnificent abundance, and the bluebonnets were exactly the same blue they had always been, and the land was good, and it was enough. It was more than enough, it was everything.